Well, how about our artists up there? They did a good job, didn't they? All right. Yeah, those are some of our children, and they illustrated the story last week as we began talking about Joseph. And kids, you're up again, okay? And some of you adults snuck some pictures in there. I can't promise you we're going to use yours, but we're going to try to kind of rotate and use as many of the kids as possible. And so this morning, as we finish up Genesis chapter 37, I want to encourage the kids to listen and to draw a picture of the story as we talk about it this morning, as we continue to talk about Joseph. Well, if you're a guest today, we're so glad you're here. And some of you guys I know are maybe new to West Jackson or maybe new to Jackson, period. And we hope that you felt welcome today and felt at home. And we're so glad you're here as we can gather in this place and worship. And last week we began looking at the life of Joseph in a series called Dreamweaver, and this is where we're going to be over the next few weeks, so I hope you come back and join us. Well, Sunday, a week ago, was the best and the worst day of Olga Carmona's life. That name may not ring a bell to you. I'd be surprised if it did. Most of us were asleep while this best moment was happening, but Olga Carmona scored the only goal in the Women's World Cup finale. Spain beat England 1-0, and that one goal was because of her. She scored that goal, and you can imagine just that kind of achievement. If you play soccer, maybe you have dreams of playing in college or even beyond that, where here's a young lady who played for her country. She represented her country in the world's greatest soccer tournament, the World Cup. And in the finale against, they were underdogs, I believe, she scored the only goal and achieved a dream in that moment and accomplished not only the win for her team, but when you do that for the World Cup, you do it for your country. And so you can imagine, as she said, she was on the mountaintop. But soon after the match, she discovered that her dad had passed away. She discovered that day, and she didn't know it during the match, or I think it happened right before the game started, and her family opted not to tell her, just they didn't want her to be thinking about that through the match. But at the end of the match, she discovered that her father, he had been sick, but he passed away back in Spain. And the day after, she made this remark. She said, "Yesterday was the best and the worst day of my life." The best day, and then in one moment, it was the worst day. And that's how life is sometimes, isn't it? I mean, we'd be kidding ourselves to hang on to any one moment and think that we're above something good happening, certainly, but also something bad happening. And I'm not trying to be a downer this morning, but we're just talking about the realities of life. And we talked about last week that you really never know what a day is going to bring. When you get up in the morning, you really don't know what each day holds. You just have to walk through it and experience it. And this is definitely true of a young man. He was only 17 years old, a young man named Joseph. The Bible is not a collection of stories about heroes who do great things for God. The Bible is a collection of stories. It's actually one story about a God who does great things through broken people. And certainly, as we begin looking at Joseph and his family last week, they fit into that category. They are a messy and broken family in so many ways. And as we read through the beginning of the story last week, we see that Jacob is a grieving father. He's lost his father. He's lost his beloved wife, Rachel. And because he's grieving, he takes all his affection and he does something that's probably unwise. He places it on one of his 12 sons. His next to youngest son's name is Joseph, and he takes all his affection and favors Joseph above the other sons. Well, they know this, and they get angry, as you would as well. It's clearly, right? Joseph is is not even the oldest son is supposed to take priority. He's the one who's supposed to take the leadership of the family. And so this went completely against Middle Eastern culture. And here we have Joseph breaking ranks because his dad is playing favorites. We also have these jealous brothers. And we're going to see where that jealousy leads them this morning. But they hated their brother because their father played favorites. And Joseph, their brother, he didn't make it any easier. He received this coat that he wore all the time. He had these 2 dreams, and in these dreams, his brothers, and one of them, his brothers are bowing down to him. They're symbolic, but the interpretation is his brothers are bowing down to him. And the other dream, not only his brothers, but his mom and dad, right? Jacob and his wives are bowing down to Joseph. And so with all this, things were a little dysfunctional in Joseph's home, in his family. Well, in Genesis chapter 37, we pick up his brothers are sent off to do work, right? They're sent off with the cattle, with the herds. And Joseph, or Jacob, the dad, decides he needs to check up on him, right? There's a little mistrust here, kind of this underlying mistrust. And so Jacob sends his son Joseph to check on his brothers, and either he's naive or unaware of the trouble that exists, right? The animosity that exists between his brothers and Joseph. But his brothers hate him. And so Jacob sends his son Joseph on this 50-mile journey. This is not out in the backyard. This is a 50-mile journey to Shechem to check up on his brothers. And little does Jacob know, the dad know, that it's going to be 20 years, over 20 years before he sees his son, his beloved son, again. In fact, things take a dramatic turn here for Jacob and Joseph as we read these words. And so as Joseph gets to Shechem, we're going to pick up in verse 15 there in chapter 37 of Genesis. Did I tell you that already? Wow, I left you hanging, didn't I? Okay, yeah, I'll give you a minute then. Genesis chapter 37, usually the first thing out of my mouth if you're here every week. Genesis chapter 37, verse 15. Joseph is looking for his brothers in Shechem. He says, a man found him there, found Joseph there wandering in the field, and asked him, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my brothers," Joseph said. "Can you tell me where they are pasturing their flocks?" "Well, they moved on from here," the man said. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And they saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. And they said to one another, "Oh, look, here comes that dream expert. So now, come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we can say that a vicious animal ate him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, that's Joseph's oldest brother, he tried to save him. And he said, "Let's not take his life." Reuben also said to them, "Don't shed his blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him," intending to rescue him from them and return him to his father. Well, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's robe, the robe of many colors that he had on, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty without water. And they sat down to eat a meal, and when they looked up, there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin going down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. And he went back to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" So they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the robe in its blood. And they sent the robe of many colors to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?" His father recognized it. "It is my son's robe," he said. "A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth around his waist and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will go down to Sheol to my son mourning." And his father wept for him. And meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards. Well, last week, if you remember Joseph's life, he was moving up in the world. He had everything going for him. He had this fancy coat. He had his dreams. He was sent on a business trip, right? He just got sent on this business trip to check out the rest of the employees, also known as his brothers. Things were going really well for him, except he had a few character flaws, as we all do. But here at the end of Genesis chapter 37, oh, how things have changed. Joseph has been violently attacked by his brothers, stripped of his robe. He's been mocked for his dreams. He's not over his brothers, right? They're not bowing down to him. Now he is begging to them, begging for his life. He's not in a place of power, but he's in the bottom of a pit, and soon he is going to be sold into slavery and headed to Egypt, 200 miles from home. You know, something tells me at the beginning of chapter 37, Joseph did not see his life going down this path. I started thinking about that. You know, we all have dreams, don't we? All of us have plans for our lives, things that we think we want to happen. And when you're a kid, these dreams can be really grand and really big. As you get a little older, you kind of shrink them down and you maybe make them a little bit more reasonable. But maybe not. Maybe you have huge dreams even here today, this morning. And listen, if you've got a dream, I would say this: there's nothing wrong with having dreams. I mean, if you have a dream, go for it. To the glory of God, go for your dreams. Right? Often God puts these passions inside of us, and so go for them. If you have a gift or an ability in a certain way, whether it be academically or physically or just with people or some type of skill, or maybe your dream is just to have a family and to raise them, to make a difference in the world. Yes, if you have dreams, go for them to the glory of God. But at the same time, right, we need to realize that God never promises to fulfill our dreams. You know, there's a Disney mindset that I think we can have that, you know, dreams are for your own making. And to a certain extent, that's true, right? If you have a dream, go for it. But unlike perhaps maybe the world sees dreams, is that you can't just be anything you want to be. You can go for it, but if you go for your dreams, but know that sometimes your dreams may not actually come to fruition. In fact, one of the shows that we've been watching, I'm a late starter with the show Shark Tank. Some of you guys have been watching it for years, but we just started like the past year, just kind of decided to start watching Shark Tank, and we'll sit down and Shark Tank, if you've never seen it, you have all these really successful entrepreneurs, businessmen, businesswomen, and these young entrepreneurs come and they share their ideas, right, with the sharks, with these businessmen, billionaires, millionaires, and they share the most random ideas, right? And you're like, man, I wish I would have thought of that. And they try to work out some kind of deal. And for the most part, they walk out of there. And I remember even this one episode, the doors closed and they start dancing and stuff and talking about, hey, just work hard for your dreams. You know, it'll come true. Nothing will stop you. And just start spewing all these things out. But I looked up the truth about those who walk out the doors of Shark Tank, that 6% of them actually go out of business, right? 6%, and that's still a high percentage, right? You still have 94%. But there's also 20% of those who are on the show that are still trying to make it happen, but they haven't gained any profit. So there's only so long you can go, right, work without gaining profit. So the truth is, 1 out of 3 people that are on Shark Tank, they're chasing down their dreams, they don't make it. Their dreams don't come true. They're working really hard, they're pushing, they're trying to make it happen, but they just don't happen. And so, yes, this morning I would say, listen, go for your dreams, go after them for the glory of God. But if somewhere along the way you find yourself like Joseph, seemingly stripped of your dreams, heading down the opposite direction, then I want you to know that your life is not over, that God has not failed you, In fact, once again, God never promises us that he will fulfill our dreams. But what we are going to see this morning is that nothing can thwart God's plans. He may not fulfill your dreams, but we can have assurance this morning that nothing is going to thwart his plans. You see, the story of Joseph is not about this young man fighting for his dreams. It's the story of a sovereign God providentially working out his plans. That's what this story is about. We can get caught up in Joseph, and there's been plays written about Joseph and singing about his dreams, and he's, on top of the world. He goes through some tragic circumstances, some difficulties, but he powers through and makes his dreams happen. That's not at all what the story of Joseph is about. The story of Joseph is not about the strength and the power and the willpower and the grit and determination of Joseph in making his dreams happen. No, the story of Joseph is a story of God, who's committed to his plan, and nothing can thwart, nothing can stop his plans for Joseph. This is what the story is about. God is sovereignly, providentially working. He's sovereign over all things, and he's providentially working to fulfill his plans. And we gave this definition last week. I want to share, it's very simple, but I think it'll help us as we think about this story, is that God's sovereignty is his authority, his rule over all things. And so we say God is sovereign, we say he has power, he has authority, he rules over all creation, over all things. But God's providence is his directions, right? Is his directing of all things to accomplish his plan. So within creation, God has a purpose. God has a plan, and his providence is him working intimately in your life, in all things, to bring about the completion of his plan. See, God didn't create the world, wind it up, and send it off and just let things take their own course. That's not how God works. We're going to see that God is intimately involved around every corner, at every moment, bringing things about for his glory and for our good. This is what the story of Joseph is about. This is Joseph's declaration at the end in Genesis chapter 50, right? We'll go to the end of the story. If you don't know how the story gets there, you'll find it out in the next few weeks. But ultimately, Joseph ends up in Egypt. He ends up in a place of power. His brothers come. They're bowing down to him. And they're like, oh, no, Joseph, right? We didn't see this coming, right? We're so sorry we didn't see this coming. And they're very repentant for throwing him in the pit. And then in Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph responds in this way. He says, you planned evil against me, but God planned it for good, to bring about the result and the survival of many people. And so Joseph looks back over his story. He doesn't break out, right, in some Disney song proclaiming the power of self-belief. That's not the story here, okay? Joseph doesn't say, hey, man, just all of us, we're all in this together, right? We made this happen together, and start dancing and shouting about, how their dreams can really happen if you just truly believe. That is not the story here. No, Joseph's declaration at the end, right, when he is in Egypt, even after his dreams have been fulfilled, because they will be, is that God did this. God even did this despite us. God made this happen. There was a sovereign God who's providentially working, right, for his glory and their good. And what I want you to know this morning is this is true for you. This is true about God in your life. That he is working in your life for your good and his glory. And no matter where you find yourself this morning, you may feel like you're headed in the opposite direction of your dreams, but God is at work. And we see how God is at work in Genesis chapter 37, even despite some pretty incredible opposition, some things that are going for him. And I want to just list out a few of those things, okay? Because some of you may find yourself in some of these situations, right? Where you feel like your back is against the wall in life because of something that's happened to you, because of just where you were born, who your family is. And we can see, listen, in all these things, God can use these things and works through these things. God is working out his plan even through dysfunctional people and situations. That's one thing we see here, right? The Bible is not just a book full of faithful heroes that do great things for God, right? It's a book of people that are messy, right? That have made a lot of mistakes. I mean, think about some of the characters in Scripture. Abraham was a liar. Remember Abraham? He's the father, right, of the Jews. But Abraham was a liar. Abraham lied in the worst possible way. Ladies, Abraham, he lied and said that his wife was his sister so that they wouldn't hurt him, right? He was going into this new town and all the guys were like, man, she's a good-looking woman, right? And so Abraham said, well, you can have her, right? Because she's not my wife, right? She's my sister. He does that once, twice. I mean, that's not somebody we want to hold up as an ideal husband or an ideal hero of the Bible, but that's exactly what happened with Abraham. Isaac did the same thing. This is Abraham's son. He was certainly flawed. He also favored one son over the other. Isaac lied about his wife, Rebekah, right, to save his own life. Then you have Jacob, Isaac's son. Jacob manipulated his brother. He deceived his own dad. He married two women. Okay, not just one, he married two. And then he also had children with the two women servants, right, that he married. Right? I mean, I know we've heard these stories, but have you ever sat back and just thought, like, how messy and how dysfunctional this all is? And I think it's good news for us, right, that the Bible tells the real stories because you're living in a real story. And I would say probably no matter how messed up your situation is, no matter how dysfunctional maybe your family of background may be or it still is today that you're walking through, God can use it. It doesn't override God's plan. Right? I mean, even in the story, we see that God uses this dysfunction to accomplish his purposes. Right? Joseph brags about his dreams. His brothers hate him to the point where they want to kill him. And actually, they're pushing God's plan along. Right? They're pushing God's plan along. And so these jealous brothers, the Joseph, the boastful brat, right? In order to get Joseph on his way to Egypt to save many lives, all these things, all this dysfunction God is using, it's taking place for his purpose. So dysfunctional families and situations, listen, God can use those things, right? God is also working out his plan even when you don't know where to go or what to do. When Joseph first gets to Shechem, he can't find his brothers. They're supposed to be there. I don't know why they're there. Shechem was kind of a bad place. And if you read a couple of chapters before that, you find out that Jacob and his family, he actually wanted to get away from Shechem. They were part of a mass massacre of all the men in Shechem. But yet here the boys are headed back to Shechem. Supposed to have the herds there. Joseph goes there to find them, and they're not anywhere to be found. Right? And so Scripture's real clear that Joseph is just kind of wondering. He's wandering in Shechem, doesn't know what to do. And who shows up? This anonymous man, right? This anonymous man shows up, and we don't know his name. He just kind of mysteriously is there. And he happens to be around Joseph's brothers when they say, hey, we're going to leave Shechem. We're going to go to Dothan. He just happens to be there and hears this so that he can instruct Joseph, right? And then Joseph happens to find him. And then he instructs him so that Joseph can go on to find his brothers. And all this, once again, Joseph doesn't know where they are. Joseph doesn't know where he is. He's wandering around looking for them, but yet this doesn't stop God's plan, right? God intervenes. This mysterious man shows up and pushes Joseph on his way. Same thing for you. You may, right now in life, you may not really know what you're supposed to be doing. You may not know what job you're supposed to have. You may not know what major you're to declare. And here I want to tell you this morning that that's okay. That just because you don't know where you are or what you're supposed to do, it does not thwart God's plans. So God is working out his plan even when you don't know where to go or what to do. God is also working out his plan when people do bad things. When people do bad terrible things, God is still working. We tend to minimize what happens here to Joseph because we know how the story ends. Yeah, he's got to go through these things, but yeah, in the end, right, he's second in command to Pharaoh. Listen, let's not overlook what happens to Joseph here. Because he doesn't have the point of privilege that we do to step back and see the whole story. No, he's walking in it, right? He's living it. And Joseph here in Genesis chapter 37, he is violently attacked by his own brothers. They strip him down. They violently throw him in this pit. And this pit would have been a cistern, probably narrow at the top, but wide at the bottom, a place where they would have held water. It says that it was empty. But his brothers throw him down in this pit. It's unclimbable. He cannot get out of there on his own. And then in Genesis chapter 42, we discover as he pleads and begs for his life, they sit around the top of the pit having a meal together. Joseph is begging for his life, and his brothers are callously having a meal. And the only way that Joseph is saved here is they ruthlessly decide to let him live so they can make a profit off of him. And so they kidnapped Joseph, then they trafficked him, and then they covered it up thinking it was over. And all along, they have no idea that their heinous acts would be central, notice this, would be central to their very salvation. That if they don't do this bad act, now they're just doing it because they're evil. But God is going to take this evil, heinous act, and He's going to use it to save them. Does that remind you of another biblical story? See in the New Testament. And then he's sold to these Ishmaelites or Midianites. More than likely, that's the same group of people. And he's sent on his way. And this evil offense actually would bring about the fulfillment of the very dreams that these brothers hated. One day they will bow down to Joseph, who they just sold into slavery. God even is working out His plan when people do bad things. And my friends, if you've been hurt by people who've done bad things to you, and I know in this room there are people that have been violated in some very evil ways. God's plan is not derailed because of the acts of bad people. He's a God who works out all things, even evil, tragic things. God's not responsible for that evil, but He works that evil out in your life, no matter how bad, no matter how difficult, no matter how painful. Then finally, I would say this: God is working out His plan even when He seems absent. Even when He seems absent, God is working out His plan. We mentioned this last week, but Genesis chapter 37 through the end of the book of Genesis, the name Yahweh, God's personal name, it rarely occurs. It occurs in an abundance, like in the first 36 chapters, but from that point on, it seems almost like God disappears. God never directly speaks to Joseph. He does with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but He never directly speaks to Joseph. And specifically here in Genesis chapter 37, there's no mention of God at all. There's no mention of God. He seems absent as this whole thing is taking place. And I would say to you this morning, listen, if you're a place in your life when you just feel like God is not there. You pray and you don't feel anything. You don't feel like He's answering your prayers. You don't see any differences in your life from your prayers. Maybe you just feel lonely and just feel far from God. I would say to you, listen, God is not absent. God is intimately involved in your life. Even when you don't feel it, by faith, we can know that God is providentially working in your life for your good and for his glory. And the story of Joseph here in Genesis chapter 37 is a testimony to that God is not absent. He is there. He is present with you. And so how do we respond to these truths? What are some practical things we can do? Well, first I would say this. You need to tether your hope to God and his plan. Have your dreams, go for your dreams for the glory of God, but tether your life and your hope to God and his plans. Your dreams are not secure enough. Your dreams are not an anchor heavy enough in this life. If you make God hostage, if you hold God hostage to your dreams, life's going to get confusing really quick. Even this happens for Jesus and his disciples. Remember Peter, one of my favorite disciples is Peter, because Peter gets this whole thing turned around. Remember Peter in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus tells his disciples that he is going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to be arrested. He's going to be beaten and ultimately put to death by the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And Peter comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, this will never happen to you. It'll never happen to you. We won't let this happen. Jesus says, Peter, get behind me, Satan. Fast forward the story. The night they're gathered at the Last Supper. Once again, Jesus tells his disciples, this is going to happen to me. You're all going to scatter. What does Peter say? Not me, Jesus, right? That's your plan. Let me tell you how it's really going to go, right? Here's the plan. I'm not going to leave you, Jesus. I'm going to stay with you right till the end, right? This will never happen to you. Once again, that's Peter's plan. And Peter's plan, is Peter being selfish here? Maybe, because it feels like it should be Jesus' plan, right? I mean, Peter's saying, Jesus, you're not going to give your life. Peter's saying, no, I'm going to have to give my life. And it sounds like Peter's plan should be Jesus' plan. But then we continue on, and Peter and Jesus and James and John, they're in the garden, right? Some of the other disciples are over there as well. And all of a sudden, the chief priests and the leaders and this mob and Judas come to arrest Jesus. And what happens there in the garden? Peter, right, takes out a sword and swings at the high priest's servant, right, and cuts off his ear. Cuts off his ear. And what is he doing? It seems like, he's protecting Jesus. That seems like the right thing to do. That seems like the right plan. And then once again, Jesus turns to Peter and rebukes him, grabs the guy's ears, back on that, and that's something, right? Hang on, no, right there, and basically undoes what Peter did, and once again rebukes him, because Peter is off on his own plan. And this morning, I wonder if that could even be some of us, right? We think we've got a pretty good plan. We think it should sound good to God, right? We're doing it for God, so we think. But it can get confusing, right? So how do we know, like, if God's plan is our plan, or if our plan is God's plan? Well, in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 through 30, this is one of the verses that we cling to when we think about all things, right? And how God is providentially working all things for our good and for his glory. And this is what it says in Romans chapter 28. It says this: we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. In verse 29, it says, for those he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Stay right there for a minute. Go back to 29, right, Paul? So, why is God working all things together for our good, for his glory? Why? How is he doing this? For what purpose? Well, he says it here, right? This is God's plan for your life. Now listen, I can't tell you all the plans God has for your life, but I can tell you this plan that God has for your life, and this is enough. Okay, this is enough to hold on to in every circumstance and situation, that God is working, right? God foreknew you before the foundation of the world. He predestined you to conform you, what? To the image of his Son. And so God's plan for your life in everything, in every situation, every day of your life, in every moment, is to conform you into the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers, so that God would have this family, right, that has this family likeness of Jesus. And so this is God's purpose for your life. And then verse 30, it says this, and those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. So God's plan for you is that he's going to continue to conform your image to that of the likeness of his Son. And then one day he's going to bring you into glory and you will be glorified. This is God's plan and purpose for our lives. And so, listen, tether your life, tether your hope to that plan. Go for your dreams, but anchor your heart in this plan. Secondly, I would say this, trust God with your everyday moments. Within your life, we live our lives in moments, everyday moments. And here's the truth about our moments, is that we have limited vision, right? We can only see in this moment. And we're limited by our experience. We're limited by our humanity. And often we make judgments declaring what is good and bad based on our own scales. But my friends, you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You don't know the decisions you make now. You don't know how they're going to ultimately influence the next day and the next day. You don't know what life is going to bring your way. There's an old Chinese story of a farmer who used to own an old horse and till his fields. And one day, the horse escaped into the hills. And when the farmer's neighbors sympathized with the old man over his bad luck, the farmer replied, "Bad luck? Good luck? Who knows?" Well, a week later, the horse returned with a herd of horses from the hills, and this time the neighbors congratulated the farmer on his good luck. And his reply was, once again, good luck, bad luck? Well, how do we know? Well, then the farmer's son was attempting to tame one of these wild horses. He fell off and broke his leg, and everyone thought, well, man, this is very bad luck, but not the farmer. His reaction was, well, good luck, bad luck, how do we know? Well, some weeks later, the army marched into the village and conscripted every able-bodied youth they found there. And when they saw the farmer's son with his broken leg, they let him off. Now, was that good luck or bad luck? Who knows? Well, I don't think life is that up and down, right? It's not controlled by fate, but it is controlled by God. And at any moment, we can automatically assume that this thing must be bad. But across this room, there is story after story after story of people who would say, I praise God for this bad thing, because it ultimately ended up being a good thing. And I think we can say that about every moment of our lives, because God is right. His plan cannot be thwarted. His plan cannot be stopped. And so if he is working all things for our good and for his glory, then that means every moment of our life, don't be too quick to judge the bad moments bad. Because even if they are bad, God can flip them for the good. Wherever you are, God is going to work it for the good. Whether you're wondering, don't really know what to do with your life, maybe you're surrounded by your enemies, maybe you're in an unclimbable pit, or you feel like you're going in the opposite direction of where you want to be. In the end, God is going to work it for your good. Or maybe it's whatever you have or don't have that seems to be stealing your joy. I would say this: God is going to use your position, right? Whether you're a supervisor or a slave, whether you're friends and family, whether you have friends and family around you, surrounding you, supporting, or whether you have no one at all, whether you have wealth or resources, or you don't have a shirt on your back like Joseph, God can use it. God will use it, ultimately for your good and his glory. So trust God with your everyday moments. 3, turn to God in your pain and disappointments. God's not up there in heaven just saying, get over it. And you need to know that. God's not sitting up there and saying, if you guys, come on. How many times we got to go over this? God is intimately involved in your life to the point where he knows exactly what you feel and what you're going through. And if you ever doubt that, you just need to flip over to the New Testament and read the story of Jesus, who experienced life like we experience life so that he could sympathize with us, so that in any moment we can turn to God and find comfort and know he knows that he loves us. One of the points we mentioned last week is when we struggle with understanding God's plan, we can find hope in Jesus. And certainly as we read the story of Joseph, we can see the life of Jesus. So you can turn to God in your pain and disappointments. 4, thank God for his unstoppable plan. Listen, there's not a day in your life that is outside of the hands of a sovereign God. Not a day. And in every day, he is not thwarted by anything. He is working for your good. Even in your pain and your disappointment. Listen, none of it's wasted. No matter how painful, no matter how tragic, none of it is wasted. Because he is unstoppable, not because you're going to work it out or not because you even understand it all, and you may not see it this side of death. But my friends, he is unstoppable, and we know this even in our death, right? That we serve a God who has conquered sin and death, that even the grave is just a doorway to step into fulfilling God's ultimate plan, right? Your glorification and your ultimate good. And we know that is how the story ends because Jesus has been there. He's done that, and he's accomplished it for you and for me. And so in our faith in Jesus, yes, we can believe that even death, even the worst case scenario, we would say for most of us, death cannot stop God's unstoppable plan. Death is a doorway, merely a doorway to our future glory selves. And then finally, take the next step. Because we know that God is providentially working out, right, his sovereign plan in your life. You can take the next step. That's what we see Joseph doing over and over again. He has these dreams, and yet he's in slavery, headed to Egypt. And yet, that's just one step of the journey. And so, in light of this faithful, sovereign, and good God, let's obediently take the next step. Let's believe that in that next step, we're one step closer to God working out his ultimate plan in our lives. Because that is the reality of whatever next step God may lead you to take this morning. Let's pray together. Would you just consider that next step? need to surrender. It could even be an attitude or bitterness in your heart or unforgiveness. Maybe there's an area of your life where you've been compromising God's holiness because you doubt his goodness in being obedient. Across this room, there's 1,000 steps that any one of you may need to take this morning. But take heart this morning, no matter how big or small that step may seem. He is a sovereign God who is working out his unstoppable plan in your life. He loves you more than you even love you. His plan for you is better than even your wildest dreams.